Good morning, or it may be good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're watching from. For me, it's precisely midday in the UK. Welcome to this webinar, the next in the series of webinars on the COVID-related themes run by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. I should just say to those people attending, the people are still joining us now, but you're very welcome and very pleased to have you with us. We will hear from our panelists. If you have questions that you would like to raise, please put them in the Q&A box. The chat function will not be available to attendees, but we'll try and pick up questions at the end for the discussion. So the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, we look at questions arising from developments in biological and medical research. It's not surprising that we've turned our attention to some questions around COVID-19, and this particular webinar is themed around questions about equity in the development of therapies and vaccines for COVID-19, which could be, hopefully, is a problem that is increasingly imminent as so much attention is going into developing those. And we've seen at the moment the Gavi Alliance Summit out of London talking about how the resource and the application of that development of vaccines might be accelerated. So we're going to look at some of the themes around that. I'm not going to spend much time giving more introductions. You can see online the details of our guests today, and I will invite them each to speak for 5 minutes or so, and then we will have opportunity for discussion at the end. Just by one piece of background that I think is relevant is a briefing note that the Nuffield Council did publish just a week ago on this question of equity in drug development. That might be a good way for people to familiarise themselves with it. If you haven't already had the chance to read it, take that away and do so. And I should just thank my colleague Arzu Ahmed, who is not with us here. She's hopefully watching, but she did all of the work in preparing that briefing note and getting us ready for today. So many thanks to my colleague Arzu. So we have Stefan Swartling from Unicef, Ellen Hoen, Medicines Law and Policy, Achal Prabhala from AccessIBSA and others things, and Sheuli Porkess from ABPI. I'm going to just go straight over now to Stefan. Please go ahead.
Thanks, you, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Let me spend my 5 minutes reflecting from a Unicef perspective, where I'm chief of the health section. And I think the corona issue now and the promise of technologies that might come in a year or two actually has us in the unique situation where the whole world wants the same thing at the same time. Because we're all in it together and we all have this need. And that means that when these technologies come, whether it's diagnostics, drugs, or vaccines, there'll invariably be a period of scarcity. And then hopefully we will reach a period of sufficient need. So a few remarks on that. The theme of our seminar today is about fair and equitable. And those words, they imply a definition of need, and that we take need into account. Now, the devil is obviously going to be in the detail of how we operationalize that need. What are the criteria that allows us to go from nice concepts into something that we can put in a spreadsheet, that allows us to go from an ethicist to a more hard-nosed health economist in deciding who gets these things first and who gets them later and who has the bigger need, and what does actually fair and equitable mean. So what are the details? What are the criteria? Already since yesterday, I think this is an increasing reality, because we now have an advanced market commitment from the Gavi pledge yesterday of $536 million towards a future vaccine. So we've seen one company join, promising 300 million doses already, and we've seen some countries join, but obviously not all. So we need that commitment to these mechanisms. But my point is, and obviously a more hard-nosed definition of what are those criteria, and that's the subject of working groups, of which UNICEF is a part. They are there in terms of the ACT accelerator and various working groups. Now, again, those working groups and those mechanisms, they arouse not out of a world government, but they arouse via some mechanism. And what is it we can hope that they can do to concretize these things so that when we're still in the scarcity situation, need can be implied. However, my second point, though, is to say that even when we reach beyond scarcity to the period of sufficient availability of these things, the same need will apply in terms of delivery systems. Because these new technologies, they will essentially be like new cars that will still need roads. And that road is a health system, because vaccines don't deliver themselves, neither do drugs or diagnostics. So we need health systems to deliver these. And already today, and that's of course what UNICEF has been working with for all of its existence, we have people who don't have this access, who live beyond the reach of systems. Already today, we have 20 million kids who are not getting immunized for the regular antigens across the world. And many of them are in populations that can be characterized as rural remote, but also urban poor, secondly, and thirdly, the displaced and the migrants. And those kids, they come from communities that are marginalized within and between countries that will have the same access problems to any future technologies that we're discussing today as they have to the technologies today. Therefore, it's imperative that already now we need to start working on these delivery systems that allow 20 million kids to be unimmunized, that allow 800,000 kids to die from regular pneumonia for lack of access to a 50-cent antibiotic ultimately across the world today. So the principal challenge is still the same as the one we've been having. How can we get essential services out there through primary healthcare, through health systems, etc. As UNICEF will be part of these mechanisms that have been set up, these working groups, to actually turn fair and equitable and need into criteria that we can put in Excel sheets. It's not going to be easy. We need already now companies and governments around the world to sign up for these mechanisms, because we can't have several. If we really want fair and equitable, we need people to join up and organizations for one. And as this seminar is a good preparation for, we need to plan for that access now. We need to build the systems, and innovation without forward planning for access and delivery systems, it will not deliver on its promise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. It's a really, really important reminder that this is, we have an acute problem now, but we've had an urgent problem for a very long time, and we will do unless we really address it. So I'm going to ask now Ellen to Hoen. Would you like to?
Yes, thank you very much. I didn't hear the last words you just said, but I guess that was a go-ahead for me. Good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this seminar. I hope my voice will hold out. I've stopped counting the seminars I've been on this week, but clearly my voice is telling me to stop talking. But I would like to go on from Stefan's last words when he said having innovation without planning for the rollout, without planning for the access is not terribly wise. That is, of course, a little bit the the model. If you look at what has happened in the past with important innovations to respond to pandemics, and here I refer to the HIV pandemic, when the medicines became available, they became available in high-income countries, but nobody had been thinking about how to roll that out throughout the developing world, where most of the people with HIV were living. That took almost a decade to get to that point. Now, there are many lessons that we can learn from HIV, many of which we should not repeat, and a few good ones that I think we should take into this this new challenge of universal access, and that will have to be global, to needed medicines, therapeutics, and vaccines to respond to COVID-19. What we see today, and that is truly unprecedented, is vast amounts of money are being pledged, are being spent on the development of therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines, and that is truly tremendous. The global pledge that was hosted by the European Commission now stands at close to 10 billion. Or most of that money will go into the development of new health tools. It is very important that we start to think about how those innovations will be made available. And I want to just spend my few minutes on talking about the launch last Friday by the World Health Organization of the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. That pool was originally proposed about 2 months ago by Costa Rica to the WHO to facilitate, to organize a place where knowledge, data, intellectual property, know-how, technology that will be or is being developed with that public financing can be shared, so that there is a place where that can be made available. When, for example, a vaccine, an effective vaccine becomes available, the demand will be enormous and it will be immediate. Efforts to scale up production need to happen now, but that has to go hand in hand with mechanisms for sharing the know-how, the IP, and the technology to make sure that that rollout can happen. Some people have referred to this as a patent pool, and I would like to stress the fact that it is much broader than that. The medicines patent pool that exists for HIV and other essential medicines will inevitably be part of it, because that's where a lot of knowledge and expertise sits. But the COVID-19 technology access pool will be broader than patents. There are other forms of intellectual property and knowledge that can be and hopefully will be shared through this mechanism. A weakness, of course, is that, and some have pointed that out, that this pool is voluntary. There is no international mechanism to force the sharing of this knowledge. That such mechanisms do exist at national level. National governments can take non-voluntary measures to get entities that hold certain rights that are necessary for public health or for public interest more broadly, to force them to share that, but that is at the international level not possible. But what is possible is to attach strings to the vast amounts of public money that is currently being spent on these innovations. Conditions to that spending could include the licensing, for example, and collaboration with this COVID-19 pool. This will require a greater spirit of multilateralism than we see today, because at the same time we see countries making pre-orders for vaccines that don't exist, attempts to get in front of the queue because certain countries have invested in the development of certain technologies, and that is something that clearly we need to move away from, and this pool can certainly make a contribution to that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's one of the questions that we might need to come back to, which is this kind of interesting conflict between the idea of people making these commitments and these commitments to global progress, and yet queue jumping happening at the same time. You know, how do we structurally get into a position where we can resolve that tension? So I'm going to move on directly now to Achal Prabhala. Achal, We didn't have a chance to say hello before you joined up, so thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to move straight over to you now and invite you to talk about bringing a particular experience, how India is experiencing the pandemic, and your own thoughts on infrastructure solutions. Thank you, Achal.
Thank you for having me, Hugh. I appreciate everything that the Nuffield Council has been doing. Firstly, can you hear me clearly? I think you're on mute. You can hear me though, right? Yeah. Shall I continue?
I hear you, but it's not very loud. If you, so I think maybe everybody would.
I'm so sorry.
Is it any better now? Can you hear me now? Is that fine? Okay, thank you very much. I'm so sorry. I had technical difficulties getting on, but let me just explain why I had technical difficulties. I use Linux. My operating system is Linux, and Zoom interfaces really badly with Linux. And so at any given point, I have multiple versions that are popping up, all conflicting with each other. So just another reason how the world is stacked against open source systems, just to note. All right, thank you very much. I appreciated the briefing notes that the Nuffield Council put out a few weeks ago. I thought it was very useful, and I think it will be useful for many, many months and years to come. I wanted to start by taking a step back from thinking about equitable access to medicines and vaccines in terms of the delivery, and move backwards in time to understand the very best methods of developing treatments and vaccines. And this connects to how open systems work versus how closed competitive systems work. The system that we have in place now, like my colleague and friend Ellen pointed out, is geared towards competition at this stage, competition now, and monopolies later. This is exactly the opposite of what we need. Competition now slows down how quickly we can arrive at effective treatments and vaccines. There are many different vaccine candidates who are working with the same type of technology. They're making the same kinds of vaccines, just separately. They could work together. There are some licenses, we believe, through Gates Foundation funding that encourage this kind of cooperation, but by no means is this a standard principle in the pharmaceutical industry. And that is the way that research is proceeding at the moment. Monopolies later, obviously, thwart access to the treatments and the vaccines. What we need is a system which enforces cooperation now and competition later. The cooperation now would arrive at the treatments and vaccines sooner, and the competition later would deliver access to those medicines and treatments to larger portions of the world than would otherwise have it. The UN came out with a very grand statement some weeks ago saying that their goal is to get medicines and treatments to everyone, everywhere. And our only hope of being able to do that is if those medicines and vaccines can be made by anyone, anywhere. So I wanted to point out that the benefits of having a more collaborative and more open system are an immediate need. They are not something that purely hinge upon the success of the equitable delivery of the products of this research. Like with Ellen, I was privileged to be at the launch of the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which is now called CTAP at the WHO. And I do believe, and many people I work with believe, that it is to date our best shot at delivering equitable access to all the technologies we need to manage and exit the coronavirus pandemic. And I think it's worth emphasizing that the CTAP, as Ellen pointed out, is not a patent pool. It is a pool for all corporations and institutions working on technologies that affect the coronavirus pandemic. It is a pool by which they can do exactly what I was describing earlier, cooperate in their efforts, as well as, of course, deliver equitable access. Now, the alternatives to the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool are the two threats that have confronted us for at least 3 decades, which are private monopolies enforced by intellectual property held by pharmaceutical corporations, which have historically not just thwarted access, but have been responsible, it must be said, for the deaths of millions of people. During the AIDS epidemic, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it took 8 to 10 years to get medicines across 12,000 kilometers, which was inexcusable. There are still several access gaps that we deal with. Access to medicines for hepatitis C, for instance, even though these medicines exist, have not yet reached anything close to universal delivery. Access to several kinds of vaccines. The pneumonia vaccine, for instance, is still severely lacking in terms of where it could go and the lives it could save. But the other threat is nationalism, which has come out as being best manifested, I think, by the huge AMCs, or these advanced market commitments that many Western countries have made, which is not really altruistic. It's just to get in front of the line and to make sure that they get the first 500 million doses or billion doses or whatever it is they're buying. There's been a gold rush. It's really a gold rush, and it's a gold that hasn't even been invented yet. So people are actually spending billions of dollars, funneling that towards corporations which have vaccines under trial, which, as AstraZeneca, one of the companies that has licensed the candidate at the Jenner Institute at Oxford, said, we fully understand might not actually work. So it's a very strange kind of gold rush. Now, finally, I think it's important to say something in the last minute of my time about Gavi and CEPI. Gavi is the Global Vaccines Alliance, and CEPI is the Center for Epidemic Preparedness. And what's important here is that they represent, most importantly, I think, a mitigation of the force of nationalism and intellectual property that would otherwise almost certainly guarantee that the world did not gain equitable access to treatments and vaccines. So it is important, I think, to note their generally positive role in being able to mitigate the circumstances. But certainly in comparison to what the COVID-19 tech pool could do, it's not a solution by any means. The licenses and the contracts that Gavi and CEPI sign are still shrouded under secrecy. We have no idea what the details of many of these licenses are. We don't understand why certain suppliers have been roped in, certain suppliers have been left out. There are many, many more vaccine producers in the world than are involved with Gavi and CEPI currently. So it sounds churlish, perhaps, to be criticizing something like the work that's going on at Gavi and CEPI, which is clearly designed towards finding a solution to the problem that nationalism and private monopolies can cause. But I think it is worth pointing out that it's by no means a perfect solution, that there are better solutions, and that they can work together in more radical ways to respond to the radical needs of the pandemic that we live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Achal. It's really interesting, really helpful, and probably a very good link and opportunity now then to pass on to our fourth and final presenter, Shirley Porkess, Executive Director of the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry. And then we can get on to some discussion after that, although I think, Achal, you say you may not be able to stay with us for the whole of the time, but so I'll just say an extra thank you to you now, and then move on to Sheuli, if you're ready.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this really, really important discussion at this time. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Sheuli Porkess. I'm as Hugh kindly said, I'm the Director of Research, Medical and Innovation at the ABPI, which is the UK trade association for the research-based pharma companies. I'd like to cover two key areas. So one, what industry is doing, and then the second is the absolute need for collaboration, whether that be with governments and health systems, but also really importantly with patients and the public. You know, we've heard about it. The rapid spread of COVID around the globe is just a major health threat for us all, and is really making us have to think about things in a different way and work in different ways, and having profound impacts across the world. And As a science-based industry, we aim to address some of the world's biggest healthcare challenges, and we're uniquely positioned to respond rapidly to this. And as industry, we've been absolutely led by our international trade association, the IFPMA, and as an industry, we're fully committed to bringing that expertise in research, development, manufacturing of medicines and vaccines to the table. And that's been echoed here in the UK. The pharma industry is a critical part of the healthcare community, and we're aiming to play the biggest role possible in supporting the fight against COVID. And I don't know a single company that doesn't feel a deep sense of responsibility to do everything they can to help in this pandemic, but no individual company or individual country or individual sector can do it on their own, and collaboration is absolutely critical, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And it does mean asking the questions that we're asking today, as they might have been questions that have been around for a long time, but they're absolutely coming to the forefront, as well as new questions. So in terms of what industry is doing, there are three key things that we're doing at the moment. One is around the research and development of new vaccines and treatments. And as of today, I think there are 374 medicines in the pipeline. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The second priority is to keep supply chains going for patients who are on who have other conditions and needs those medicines, and people who need the vaccines. And companies have been working night and day to make sure that medicines can continue to flow as normal across borders for all patients. We face significant challenges as a result of COVID, with it being a global pandemic. And in the UK, we're working closely with government and NHS to put in place measures, and that's mirrored internationally with close collaboration with regulatory agencies and global stakeholders to make sure we can continue to supply those existing medicines and vaccines for other conditions, whilst also continuing clinical research into new options and treatments for other diseases as well as COVID. So thinking of that broader perspective there. And then I think the third thing that I'll just mention briefly is, and I'm speaking from a UK perspective here, is companies working to support the NHS. So whether it's repurposing laboratories to help with testing, or individuals within companies coming forward to go back to clinical practice, and examples like that. But now focusing on research and patients, I mentioned there are 374 candidates in medicines in development, 44 of which have made it to clinical trials, with almost 2,000 trials worldwide, 133 candidate vaccines, of which 10 are in clinical evaluation, and about 3/4 of those being developed by industry, with the remaining by academia, public sector, or other non-for-profit organisations. Worth remembering, there's no guarantee of success, as few treatments and even fewer vaccines may prove to be safe and effective. And I also really want to iterate, we have to make sure that the research is robust and reliable, and it's being done to the right standards. We've got to be making decisions based on research that we can trust. In terms of that research, the quickest option is repurposing existing treatments, so medicines that are already approved for treating other conditions. And that's because we know about those medicines already, they're already being manufactured. But then we also think about the exploratory research, and that's going to be further off and take longer to develop. And if we turn to vaccination, I think the key thing here is the know-how. So it's not just about finding and developing a vaccine and proving it works and it's safe, but it's how to produce that at scale, ensuring that every dose is the same as the one before and the one after, and that's absolutely critical. And there's a time element there as well, so it's going to take time to make sure we've done those processes sensibly and appropriately. And a realistic estimate is 12 months minimum, but it could be longer. And yeah, as I said before, stepping back, no single sector or organisation can do this on their own, and we have to collaborate. So in the last minute or two then, so what does collaboration look like? So at the moment, companies are collaborating with the European Medicines Agency, World Health Organization, global public health authorities, including FDA and many others, to address the crisis. And as has been mentioned, the global industry through the IFPMA joined the WHO as a founding partner to launch a new global collaboration to accelerate the development, production and equitable access to new COVID-19 tools called the ACT Accelerator. And by doing this, industry is committing to accelerate development, production and equitable global access to safe, effective and affordable therapeutics and vaccines. And that's the right thing to do. There are 3 pillars in that, and one of the pillars on vaccines, so it's diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines. Gavi, that's been mentioned by the previous speaker, is co-leading the vaccines pillar of that and is responsible for coordinating the global access facility to guarantee access to volumes of vaccines for countries. And I'm sure a number of you heard Bill Gates speaking yesterday about the incredible level of collaboration underway to ensure manufacture of whichever vaccine can take place in multiple factories at scale and pace. And the Gates Foundation has teamed up with a number of companies to accelerate that research and development and manufacture. What Bill Gates said was, even if the companies are saying, even if their vaccine isn't eventually chosen, they're stepping up to offer their manufacturing facilities all around the world to ramp up that manufacturing as fast as possible. We've also got a European collaboration through the Innovative Medicines Initiative, with 8 projects being selected for fast-track funding, and those involve 94 organisations, universities, research organisations, companies and public bodies. And in the last minute, I think the absolute critical thing here is about public and patient engagement and involvement and transparency. We have to have public trust and engagement with the development and rollout of any treatment or vaccine. As ABPI, we've been working cross-sector and internationally on patient and public involvement for a number of years now, and actually there's never been such a need as there is now. We've seen particular concerns about the disproportionate impact on BAME communities, and we need to make sure that we do research in a way that addresses COVID-19 needs. And how do we make sure the research we're doing is robust and reliable? How do we get patients into research? How do we ensure the research is relevant for patients? People with comorbidities have traditionally been excluded for research, but we know they're affected more, so we need to find ways of getting them into the research. Which treatments are best? How do we ensure we meet the public's needs for information so that they can trust in the research? Even when we have a vaccine, how do we make sure people trust enough to actually have the vaccine? All very well saying we'll manufacture and distribute it, but if people then don't want to actually have the vaccine, that's a big hurdle. And what happens if the vaccine only works for specific types of people? How do we make sure we're explaining that? So I'm going to stop there because there's lots more I could cover. But yeah, again, delighted to be part of this conversation, because I think it's the conversations we need to be having, and now's the time to do it.
Thank you so much, Sheuli, and if you'll stay with us for a little while, I'm going to pick up on the last set of points that you made. Achal did have to leave us. I thought Stefan may still be with us, but just through a
I'm with you.
You are there, Stefan. Good, thank you. So I'm going to pick up a few questions that have come in through the Q&A now, and one which relates to the last point in a way, which is from Francois Houyes. The question is, when prioritization criteria are decided and different populations may or may not receive treatments or vaccines, how are citizens to be consulted? How do we know that the population agrees with these approaches and that we can adhere to it? So this is not just we decide the prioritization of delivery, but how do we know that this, how do we ensure this gets brought into at a wider public level? I'm going to ask somebody just to wave their hand or jump in and speak to this. Sheuli.
I'll start with you. I mean, I think it's absolutely critical that we build in public engagement to every mechanism that we have available. So whether that's government task forces looking at how to manage it within their countries, whether it's researchers designing their clinical trials, we need to build in public engagement or even patient engagement. We now have a growing, unfortunately growing cohort of people with lived experience, people who've actually had COVID, survived it and can talk about it, and we need to build their experiences into the research as we're doing it. To do research and then at the end sort of present the research to the public and say, this is what we need to do, isn't the right way forward. It's not the right way forward at any other time, but especially not now. And actually we've got an opportunity here in that everybody is talking about research. If you switch on the news, you know, the general news in the evening, there will probably be someone talking about research and to do with COVID. Now's the time to actually say, right, how do we help the public and patients engage with that conversation and help us decide our priorities? What is it that we need from research, from whether it's research into therapeutics, research into ways of living during COVID, or research into the vaccines? We absolutely need to do it. I think it's there's sometimes a potential barrier in that people say, oh, if we have to get public and patients involved, that might take longer. But actually, I see that if we don't do that, you know, taking a few extra hours to get a patient and public involvement in the research now will save a lot of time later, because it can give you those critical insights. But yeah, everybody needs to commit to it. Sorry, go on.
I just wanted to widen it up and see if there's an observation from anyone else about not just about people being involved in the research, but also being involved in considering the priorities, research priorities at that kind of upstream level of deciding on priorities and considering policy. Yeah.
If I may, I would like to make a few comments there, because I think Sheuli raised a number of important points. There's another one, and particularly from the international perspective, I think is key, and that is transparency. A year ago at the World Health Assembly, there was a transparency resolution, transparency in the pharmaceutical sector, which laid out some norms on transparency with regard to costs and spending of R&D, pricing of pharmaceutical products, etc. And I think that requirement of greater transparency is really very, very important, because we see all kinds of agreements being made at the moment between those that hold the money back and those that can do the research, agreements between entities that do research. CEPI has agreements with entities that are engaged in innovation, but most of those agreements are confidential. They're secret. You can't really have a look at them and see, are the terms and conditions, do they indeed meet public health requirements, for example. I've had some experience myself when I set up the medicines patent pool 10 years ago, when we decided that all of our agreements would be fully transparent and would be published full text on our website. And there were many people said, you're crazy, that will never happen. The drug companies will never agree to that. This is, you know, you're dead before you even get out of the door. And in practice, that turned out to be much less of a problem than was predicted. But the belief that transparency is somehow harmful for coming to good public health-based agreements is a very strong belief, and it's a mistaken belief. And I think we need to really work to get rid of it, because what is invested now is our money, billions of it, but we can't really track and trace how it's being spent and how the priorities are set. And that really has to change. That will help a great deal to get greater confidence from the public, but also a greater sense of international solidarity, because people in countries that depend on that kind of spending, which is mostly not by their own governments, just have to sit back and wait that the right thing is being done. And that is not the way to go today.
Well, Stefan here, if I can come in, I agree fully with the transparency issue, but there's also the issue about knowing what you need, and that what you want is not necessarily what you need. If I can take a current example, I was just on a seminar with one of our UNICEF country offices yesterday from a country that was prioritizing ventilators for COVID at the expense of broader oxygen therapy and was experiencing terrible mortality rates with ventilators. So I think it's not just the transparency, it's also the information need, and it shouldn't be decisive, but it should be consultative. Over.
Thank you. One of the things that struck me as I listened to all of the presentations is that whilst we've got a lot of strong commitment from industry, from states, from different communities, there's also quite a lot of a number of different initiatives, and looking from the outside, it's quite difficult to monitor. Where is CEPI, where is Gavi, what is the WHO related to UNICEF? There are a lot of initiatives which all sound as though they're very positive, but how do they fit together? How is there a kind of coordinating theme that can help to make this work? And here I'm thinking again about that there is still a pressure of the kind of nationalist tendency to try and achieve the benefit for each country for itself. So how does the coordination work to make all of these initiatives come together? Ellen, are you?
Yeah, I would say the role of the World Health Organization in all of this is absolutely crucial. They're sort of the spider in the web, bringing all these various pieces together. They're also crucial in what Stefan just pointed at, the priority setting. What are the technologies that are really needed? What are the ones that are the most effective? Which are the ones that whose production need to be scaled up, and where does that need to happen? Those kinds of questions are really the questions that the WHO needs to answer, needs to be in the lead of. Today, of course, with the current U.S. administration, is terribly unfortunate what is happening there. The WHO is under all kinds of political pressure, and I hope that the European countries can come together with other nations of the planet to continue to form and assure a very strong backing, including all the financial resources that are necessary for the World Health Organization to do its work. Because without that, I don't know how we're ever going to get out of this situation. The WHO is really absolutely crucial in this.
And this is I'll ask Stefan and then Sheuli to on this observation that this is something that is not just for COVID, and we talked about this earlier. This is not just for now. This is for the future. This is for the duration and for many other health problems that are experienced around the world. Stefan.
No, definitely, I think so, and there's I think there are estimates that 2/3 of child and maternal mortality that we see in the world today is actually unnecessary because people don't have access to known technologies that are even affordable. So this feeds, I think COVID illustrates the bigger issue and the tragedy of how we actually work on access, fair and equitable, fuzzy concepts as they may be. So I hope that we can actually use the COVID impetus now to really invest in these systems that will take care not just of COVID access, but for instance, regular pneumonia. How come 800,000 kids can die from regular pneumonia for lack of an existing vaccine, for lack of a 50-cent antibiotic year in, year out? So yes, these are everyday problems, and by all means, let's use the impetus of this crisis now to actually address them and solve them. But a lot of that devil is in the delivery system detail.
Indeed. So we've got everything from basic research through to drug development, to production, to distribution and delivery and access. And Sheuli, I mean, the readiness of industry to work on this now, do you see that something that will be durable, that will create some new infrastructures and relationships across industry, government, communities, etc.?
Well, Stephanie, I think we've had a naive belief that industry can solve all of these issues. It has to be public-private partnerships that actually look at the whole access issue and the whole chain. Over.
Yeah, Sheuli.
Yeah, maybe if I just come in. So I think just going back to the question before about coordination, I think that's a really absolutely critical point. You know, we've got industry ready to deploy this expertise and this R&D, and how does industry best do it? Is it through working with national? Is it working internationally? And that's absolutely something that as the trade associations, we're working with stakeholders to say, help us help our members, our companies know where they can best collaborate. And I think thinking about that coordination piece, you know, I mentioned there are almost 2,000 trials of medicines, of these 44 medicines, 2,000 clinical trials. You know, how to coordinate and interpret that data is really important, because those results are now starting to come through. In terms of, you know, what could change as a result of COVID, you know, we've seen some different ways of doing things, so different ways of research and different ways of fulfilling the regulations, so what's being called regulatory flexibilities. And we've been working together with other trade associations with a body called ICMRA, the International Coalition of Medical Regulatory Authorities, I think, to say, okay, some of those regulatory flexibilities were necessary because we're working from home and you can't have the face-to-face contact you want. But actually some of those might be beneficial to carry forward in the future. So if you can do trials in a way that means patients don't have to go into hospital as much because they can have the medicine delivered to home, for example, actually that could be a good thing for the future, and that could happen across other disease areas, not just COVID. And that piece of learning, so to your question, could we do things differently? Absolutely. And that's something I'm particularly passionate about, is we're going through this now. Let's not lose that thinking. Let's build on it, but not just in the UK. We have to do that thinking internationally to actually make benefit from it.
Thank you. And Ellen, did you want to add a word? And then I'm going to ask you each one brief final question.
Well, I would like to add, and this is actually also a message for Sheuli. I think it is crucial that the pharmaceutical industry also educate itself and look seriously at the COVID-19 technology access pool, because they have been missing in action with regard to the technology access pool. They were not present at the launch on Friday, and public communication indicated that the initiative was not well understood. And clearly, since this is a voluntary mechanism, it will be crucial. I understand it's not only the pharmaceutical industry that will create the knowledge and the intellectual property, but they are an absolutely crucial player. And it would be very important for them to come forward. So this is sort of an open invitation to consider this proposal very seriously.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm aware that there are a good number of questions that we've not been able to pick up. I've tried to gather in from the questions that have been put, the general points to put to our panelists. But just in the last minute that we have, what I would just like to do is to invite the three of you who are still with us, just to give us a reason for optimism. What is the, you know, just in 10 seconds or so, what is the thing that makes you feel optimistic at the moment about how we might, on this occasion, find a solution that gives us better, fairer, broader access to the novel treatment or vaccine? Sheuli, a quick.
For me, it's the unprecedented scale of collaboration that I'm seeing, just within countries, across sectors. That collaboration allows conversations, and from conversations, actions can happen. So that's my optimism for you.
Thank you. Ellen?
I agree with Sheila, and I would add to that the massive public financing that was so rapidly brought together and is rapidly being spent. I think that is reason for optimism, because you need the money to do this work. And second, my local bakery who has a sign outside that says, if you've lost part of your income, you will get your bread for free.
Thank you. Stefan.
I'm very excited about the Gavi replenishment yesterday, $8.8 billion raised. Now, I think the challenge now is actually to work on the delivery systems today, because unless we can immunize the missing kids now, we're not going to immunize the missing people who need COVID vaccine in the future. So that's my one big hope. The second hope I see is, as you've alluded to, the collaboration and the public-private, and I think we can actually use it. And we need to use it to assess also other systems. The empty antibiotic pipeline, where pure commercial innovation is not going to solve it. The gram negatives that kill our kids, that kill ourselves as we get cancer, and will really the slow pandemic. So by all means, there's a room for optimism in the midst of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think that, you know, let us hope that the optimism is well placed, that that this immense collaboration and positive contribution from all sides can deliver therapies and vaccines for COVID, delivered rapidly, but also that provides an infrastructure that we can continue into the years to come. So many thanks to you all, Sheuli, Ellen, Stefan, and to Achal, who is no longer with us. Thank you everybody for listening in. We hope to have another webinar in a couple of weeks' time, which is probably going to be around testing for COVID, swab testing and immunity testing. So thank you once again to all of you, and we'll see you all soon.